Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I think a lot of you know that the material that I cover on the Monday morning videos often arises from situations that have crossed my desk during the past week or so, and that's the case again today. I want to talk to you about wet basements. We've talked about it before, but it's a situation that came up quite recently, and I thought it was worth reviewing. Received a call from a buyer. Interestingly enough, the buyer bought a property last fall. Didn't deal with our office. There was a cooperating broker that they dealt with, but it was our listing. What happened was they bought the property, and this spring, in fact, quite recently, they had some leakage in the basement, and they weren't told about it. And as far as they were concerned, the seller had an obligation to tell them about the basement leaking, and he didn't, so they felt that that was deceitful. They got a price for repairing it, and they expected the seller to reimburse them for that cost. Well, we talked to the seller, and the seller said, you know, I bought the property 4 years ago, and since I've owned it, there's never been any sign of any moisture in the basement. Moreover, when I bought it, there was never any mention to me about problems of water leakage in the basement, so I had nothing to declare. Well, it's interesting, this whole business about water in a basement. And it's a complicated issue that comes up over and over and over again. Let me share with you a couple of situations, and one of them I shared before, but I think it bears repeating. We had a listing some years ago. Actually, it was in Welland. It was a house that had an unfinished basement. And the buyer, in the spring, months after they'd closed on the deal, experienced leakage in the basement. So it turned out that on the listing, there was a reference to the seller property information statement back when it was the norm to use these and make them available to the buyer. So the seller, through their agent, contacted us, we were the listing office, and requested a copy of the seller property information statement. We sent it to them, and in the seller property information statement, it clearly stated that in the northeast corner of the basement, there is water leakage in the spring. So it was right there. The thing is that the agent representing the buyer never bothered to ask for it. Well, we thought that'd be the end of it, but they ended up taking it to court. So it went through our errors and omission, it went to court, and the judge ruled against us. The judge took the position that although we had put it in a seller property information statement, that wasn't good enough. The buyer may have had an inept agent, which they obviously did, but it was incumbent on the seller and the seller's representative to make sure that a buyer was aware of a deficiency. So the obligation wasn't just to put it in seller property information statement, but make sure that that seller property information statement got into the hands of the buyer. Contrasting that, another situation, it didn't involve our office, but I read about it. Again, there was a leak in the basement, and it went to court, and the judge threw it out. The judge said there was nothing to disclose. He said all basements leak. I don't necessarily agree with him, but that was his position, and he threw it out. What it does illustrate is that small claims court is the Wild West. It pretty much goes run by the seat of your pants. You're not bound by precedent from what's been ruled before, and so you never know how it comes down. But it also lets you know that you need to be very careful when it comes to egressing water, leakage in a basement. You need to, first of all, answer the question, is it latent defect or is it patent defect? You know, if it's a patent defect, it's buyer beware. It's up to them to do their investigation and discover it themselves. If it's a latent defect, it's incumbent on the seller, if they know about it, to disclose it. There's a bunch of questions you want to ask yourself and maybe ask a buyer if you're representing them. First of all, when you're going through the property, is there any sign of moisture? Sometimes there's not water on the floor, but you can see that there's indication, effervescence on the wall, or something to indicate that there has been a water problem. Is the basement finished, and is it recently finished? Has it been recently painted or repainted? In other words, is there sign of active concealment? So if the seller's working on trying to hide the fact that water leaks into the basement, not saying anything about it, is there some sign that that's going on? So I would say that anytime you're dealing with taking a listing, treat water in the basement as a latent defect, and it's got to be disclosed if it's known. You know, it brings me back to way back in 1984 when I first opened up Remax Garden City in St. Catharines. We had those catalogs back then, and it was a common practice anytime there was a basement that was unfinished, instead of putting in the listing unfinished, they put high and dry. High meant it wasn't a crawl space. You could stand up in there, and dry, well, it meant dry. You might as well say, sue me, because you're saying, you're making a statement, you're making a declaration, you're making a promise, no water leaks into the basement. Hey, what did the judge say? All basements leak. So you be careful about that. Fortunately, we're not doing that anymore. But what I would advise you to do, it was a common practice, as I mentioned that property we had in Welland. It was a common practice back in the day to use seller property information statements. And those statements were a thorough questionnaire of all kinds of information about the property, about its structural issues, about its environmental issues, about water issues, about problems, and so on. And you'd take that question by question up with the seller, and you'd make that available to any potential buyer. Lawyers representing the sellers hated it. They hated it because they said it reveals patent defects. You're asking questions that you don't have to reveal to a potential buyer, and you are by using this form. So it isn't just latent defect, it's patent defects. In response to that, the Ontario Real Estate Association came up with a residential information checklist, Form 820 as opposed to 220. It's the same form, same questions. The only difference is the 820, the residential information checklist, doesn't have to be made public. It's private between the seller and his agent. So you ask the same questions, and you should always use the residential information checklist 820 when you take a listing. Ask these questions. There's a lot of very, very important questions in there. I mean, it asks, for example, are you aware of any moisture or water problems? It says, have you made any renovations or additions and improvements in the property? And did you get a building permit? You know, there's so many questions you might not think to ask. Very early in my career, before any of this was on the table, I remember selling a property and the buyer telling me after the fact that there was an oil tank buried in the front yard. I had no knowledge of that, but I never would have thought to ask. We were involved in selling a property one time, I remember, and it came to light after the fact that there had been a pool in the backyard and it wasn't removed, it was filled in. When the buyer found that out, they walked away from the deal. They said, if we want to put a pool in, there'd be all kinds of expense removing what's there. And we're not interested in that. So they walked away. And now, are these questions that you're going to think about, but yet they're patent defects? They're latent defects. They have to be disclosed. So get in the habit of using the residential information checklist. But if we go back to the original question, and a buyer who after the fact discovers that the basement leaks and they weren't told, do they have access to the seller and a justifiable cause for action in the courts? And what they have to prove about, it could be water in the basement, it could be anything. What they have to prove is, first of all, that it is a latent defect, and second of all, that the seller was aware of it, either that he had experienced it himself or he was been made aware of it previously. And that's how the questionnaires come in the form about urea formaldehyde example. Did you ever put it in? Did you ever have it removed? As far as you know, was it ever removed by somebody else? They ask these questions to get a little bit of background. And if you know and you fail to disclose, then you've got an obligation to the buyer because you've purposely misled them. And then, of course, if you try to actively conceal it, if it's moisture in the basement, we've seen them where properties, the foundation is splitting and sliding into a ravine, and that's been covered up. If it's active concealment and that can be proved, the seller, rightfully should be held accountable. So I hope this makes sense. Keep this in mind, and don't forget, use this residential information checklist, Form 820, when you're taking a listing. Thank you very much. Talk to you again next week.